I was up late again, trying to finish the final revisions on a project that had been nagging me for weeks, when my phone buzzed on the kitchen table, a subtle vibration in the dimly lit room that drew my attention away from the blinking cursor on my laptop screen. And although I almost ignored it, assuming it was just another spam message, I felt an inexplicable compulsion to check, hoping for some small distraction from the tedium that had become my nightly routine. The message was from a number I didn't recognize, nothing unusual at first glance, but as my eyes adjusted to the glow of the screen, I felt a cold pang in my chest upon reading a single word: hello, surrounded by an atmosphere of foreboding that seemed to spill out of the device like an unseen presence breathing across my skin. At first, I told myself it was some misguided friend using a new number or just an accidental text, but something about the timing, midnight on the dot, with no preceding conversation, made me hesitate before responding, a prickle of unease dancing along my forearms as if the house itself had inhaled an expectation of my reply. Eventually, curiosity overpowered caution, and I typed back a hesitant greeting, half hoping that the mysterious texter would clarify who they were so I could either resume my work with a mild story to tell or block them if it turned out to be something sketchy. Yet the moment I hit send, a strange tension settled over the kitchen, as though unseen eyes now lingered in every corner, waiting to see what would happen next. The reply arrived almost instantly, too quickly for comfort, reading, "I've been trying to reach you," accompanied by a gnawing feeling in my gut that told me this conversation was no ordinary exchange of words, and despite my mind's protests, I decided to press further, replying that I thought they might have the wrong number, just to give them an easy out if it was all a misunderstanding. Instead of an apology, they responded with a question about my name. My full name, a detail that sent a cold shock through my veins because they spelled it perfectly, exactly as my grandmother used to write it in birthday cards, with a slight flourish at the end that even my closest friends rarely bothered to use. I remember setting the phone down on the counter, the fluorescent kitchen light casting harsh shadows across the table, and pacing in circles with my heart pounding, wondering if this could be some elaborate prank orchestrated by someone who knew my personal details, or if I was letting my exhaustion conjure sinister explanations out of thin air. As minutes ticked by without any further messages, I considered simply blocking the number, but there was an irrational part of me that felt compelled to uncover the truth, as if I owed it to myself, or maybe to some deeper curiosity, to see just how far this strange communication would go. So I finally messaged back asking who they were and how they knew me. Their response was chilling in its simplicity: "We share the same nightmares," followed by an unsettling string of ellipses that conjured mental images of a silent, unreadable presence on the other side of the screen, someone who apparently believed we were intimately connected through our fears, and even though it made no logical sense, I felt a tremor of recognition deep within my bones. My mind raced back to the nightmares that had plagued me for months, a recurring dream in which I was trapped in an old, decrepit house, the walls dripping with shadows that whispered my name, and a relentless sense of being watched from behind doors I dared not open. Yet how could someone else know about these nightmares, let alone share them in any capacity? In a moment of unsteady bravado, I typed a short description of one of my most vivid nightmares, just enough details to see if the stranger truly knew anything, or if this was all some twisted guess, and my palms went clammy as I hit send, dreading their response more than I wanted to admit. The answer arrived in mere seconds, describing the exact same hallway from my dreams, the same peeling wallpaper, the same thunderous silence, even the same crooked painting of a faceless child that hung near the turn, making my breath catch in my throat and a wave of dizziness roll through me, as if the floor had momentarily tipped under my feet. I stood there in the kitchen, transfixed by my phone's glow, feeling as though a crack had opened between reality and nightmare, allowing something impossible to slip through in the form of typed words, and I asked again who they were, desperation seeping into my voice as I pressed for any tangible explanation behind this impossible knowledge. All I received was another cryptic statement: "I'm the one who saw you in that house," which only deepened the sense of dread that had begun to coil around my heart, and I realized my work project was the last thing on my mind now, overshadowed by a need to understand how some unknown presence could insert themselves into the darkest corners of my subconscious. For the rest of that night, the text continued in short, haunting bursts, vague references to whispered names, descriptions of locked doors I had dreamed of but never dared to open, and repetitive warnings urging me to find the key before midnight tomorrow, though no amount of questioning would clarify what that key was or why tomorrow was so important. By the time the sun rose, I felt as though I hadn't slept in years, my nerves frayed and my sense of normality shattered. Yet despite the lingering fear, a grim determination took hold, compelling me to unravel the source of this phenomenon, even if I had to step into the darkest recesses of my own mind to do so. In the light of day, the messages stopped entirely, granting me a reprieve but offering no sense of comfort, because part of me feared that the midnight threshold would bring a fresh barrage of cryptic texts, each more disturbing than the last, and I spent the morning looking over old journal entries I'd kept about my nightmares, trying to see if there was any clue I had overlooked. I discovered a single passage mentioning a shattered mirror in one of the recurring dreams, the shards reflecting my face from multiple angles, an image that had always disturbed me yet felt crucial somehow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this mirror might hold some significance in the puzzle the stranger was laying out through the midnight text chain. The hours passed in a blur of anxiety, every moment dragging me closer to the next midnight, and though I tried to continue my normal routine, grocery shopping, a brief video call with a colleague, tidying up the house, I couldn't stop checking my phone every few minutes, paranoid that I'd see that unknown number pop up again, or worse, that my phone would spontaneously ring. When midnight did arrive, the phone vibrated with a startling intensity, displaying the same unknown number, and I took a shaky breath before opening the message, bracing myself for more cryptic torment, only to find a singular line, "Did you find the key?" which sent me into a panic spiral, because I had spent all day turning the question over in my mind, unable to figure out what it might mean or where to begin searching. In a desperate flurry, I typed back a series of questions, explaining that I had no idea what the key could be, that this felt like a terrible prank or a malicious haunting, and I demanded answers that would help me close whatever rift had opened between my nightmares and my waking life. The response was instantaneous, as if they had typed it before receiving my message. "You've held it all along," followed by a single emoji of a house, which felt both absurd and terrifying, an incongruous modern symbol pinned to a centuries-old fear, leaving me reeling as I tried to decipher its meaning in the gloom of my living room. Images of my recurring nightmare flooded my thoughts. The endless corridor, the creaking floorboards, the stench of mildew, and that sense of being pursued by unseen eyes, all culminating in a locked door I had never mustered the courage to open. Perhaps the dollhouse I inherited from my grandmother was a clue, or maybe a childhood memory I'd long since buried held the answer. Rummaging frantically through my storage boxes, I recalled a small wooden box my grandmother once gave me, telling me it held old dreams I might one day need. And although I dismissed it as a whimsical metaphor at the time, I now tore through my belongings to find it, goosebumps prickling my arms when I finally clutched the dust-laden box in my hands. Inside, I found a yellowed piece of paper with a sketch of a strange symbol that resembled an ornate key, accompanied by a barely legible note in my grandmother's handwriting mentioning liminal spaces and a chain of midnight messages, words that caused my heart to flutter with eerie familiarity, as though she had somehow foreseen this entire ordeal. The phone buzzed again, nearly causing me to drop the box, and I glanced at the text to see a new instruction. Draw it on the door, followed by a mention of 3 a.m., which loomed just 3 hours away, giving me precious little time to interpret what door they meant and what might happen once I complied. My mind raced, piecing together the references to my nightmares, the mention of locked doors, the midnight text chain, and my grandmother's cryptic note, concluding with a dreadful certainty that if I wanted to break this cycle, I had to face the door in the dream, the same one I always fled from. But how to do that in the waking world remained a maddening puzzle. I prepared for what felt like a ritual, scribbling the key symbol from my grandmother's drawing onto a page in my notebook, practicing until I could replicate it perfectly, all the while sensing an unspoken threat ticking away each minute as 3 a.m. crept closer, a time notorious for bearing supernatural significance. Slipping into an uneasy half-sleep, I clutched my phone and a pen, determined to recreate the symbol in my dream if that was even possible, or at least gather the courage to confront the door once I reached it. But in the back of my mind, I feared that the text messages would continue to escalate, guiding me into unknown depths where my soul might be at risk. When the clock struck 3 a.m., my phone vibrated violently, and I felt a rush of vertigo that blurred the line between waking and dreaming, as if I were suddenly cast into that familiar hallway. Only this time my phone was in my hand, its screen flickering with the words, "Open the door," in the same unknown number's chat window, beckoning me to step forward. Heart hammering in my chest, I approached the door that had always terrified me, its age-wood scarred with scratches and stained with something dark, while a single overhead light swayed, casting a trembling glow across the threshold, and I raised my pen, still in my dream, somehow, and shakily drew the symbol on the door, just as the text had instructed. A sharp static screech filled the hallway the instant I finished the final line, and the phone's screen flashed rapidly, revealing a flurry of images. Someone's face twisted in horror, an empty rocking chair, a window looking out onto a starless sky, flashes that made no logical sense yet felt intimately tied to the nightmares I've been having, all converging around the handle of that locked door. Summoning what tiny scrap of bravery I possessed, I gripped the doorknob, half expecting it to scorch my hand or vanish altogether, but it turned smoothly, and the door opened onto a room that smelled of damp air and old wood, reminiscent of an abandoned cabin on the edge of a forgotten forest, even though it was merely a step away from that endless corridor. Inside, I found a single figure crouched in the corner, illuminated by the eerie glow of my phone's screen, which now shone brighter than any flashlight, and as I approached, I realized the figure was wearing my clothing, had my haircut, and bore a resemblance so uncanny that I staggered backward, mind reeling at the sight of someone who looked exactly like me, hunched over in silent terror. The moment I locked eyes with this other version of myself, my phone buzzed with another message, set them free, cryptically urging me to do something I couldn't fathom. Yet I sensed that the reflection in the corner was more than just a mirror image. It was a fragmented piece of my psyche, trapped in nightmares that had been stalking me for far too long. With trembling fingers, I reached out and touched the figure's shoulder, feeling a sensation akin to touching cold glass, and in that instant, my phone began to ring. No longer a text, but an actual call from the unknown number, the screen pulsing with an eerie luminescence that threatened to drown out my surroundings. Accepting the call felt like diving off a cliff into pitch black water, my consciousness momentarily splitting between the phone pressed to my ear and the surreal dreamscape around me. But I heard a distorted voice that sounded like 1,000 versions of my own voice layered on top of one another, telling me I had to merge the chain to reclaim what was lost. Without knowing precisely what that meant, I lifted my phone toward the figure in the corner, letting the light wash over them, and as I did, they began to dissolve into pale tendrils of mist, each tendril swirling around the phone and disappearing into the device, creating a pattern on the screen that resembled the key symbol I'd drawn earlier. My stomach churned with a mixture of horror and relief, suspecting that I was witnessing a reconciliation of fragmented parts of myself, or perhaps a banishment of the nightmare entity that had masqueraded as me. But when the last wisp of mist vanished into the phone, the door behind me slammed shut, leaving me in darkness save for the phone's glow. The text chat resumed, lines of text scrolling by far too quickly to read, each message flickering with ghostly energy until a final message froze on the screen, reading, "Now you are whole," and the phone abruptly powered off, plunging me into absolute blackness, where I felt my heartbeat echo through every corner of the silent space. Somehow, I forced my eyes open to find myself back in my own bedroom, the sheets twisted around my legs, sweat matting my hair to my forehead, and the phone lay on my nightstand, silent and dark, as if nothing had transpired. Yet the lingering dread and exhaustion in my bones told me it had been more than just a dream. The following day, I discovered no record of those texts or calls in my phone's history, no unknown number of my contacts, and yet the visceral memories refused to fade, leaving me to wonder if I had truly ended the midnight text chain or merely shifted it deeper into my subconscious, waiting for another fateful hour to call me back. In the afternoons, I tried to lead a normal life, returning to work and chatting with friends, but every night, I worried I would hear the phone buzz at midnight once more, announcing a new message in that impossibly cryptic manner, a fear that lingered like a phantom ache no matter how much time passed. Weeks went by, and the text did not resume. My nightmares dissipated, and I slept more soundly than I had in months, leading me to believe I had broken free of that insidious chain, though a small corner of my mind remained guarded, anticipating the next chilling revelation. One late evening, as I was drifting off to sleep, I was startled awake by a message notification, and my heart leaped into my throat as I fumbled for the phone, expecting the worst, only to find a harmless promotional text from a local grocery store, a relief so palpable that I laughed at myself for being so paranoid. Yet the sense of relief was short-lived, for as I scrolled through my messages, my eyes caught a glitch, a single line of distorted text that flickered on screen for less than a second, too fast to read, but reminiscent of the eerie chat logs I thought I'd left behind, and I felt that old dread tighten its grip around my heart. Determined not to be a victim of these midnight horrors again, I used every ounce of rationality I had to dismiss the glitch as a technical hiccup. A persistent sense of unease gnawed at me, prompting me to investigate the deeper layers of my phone's storage, searching for hidden files or remnants of something sinister. To my shock, in the phone's system logs, I stumbled upon encrypted text strings timestamped at midnight every night for the past week. Even though I never heard any notifications or saw any messages, and each file was labeled with the cryptic phrase, "They're not gone," driving home the terrifying realization that the text chain had not truly ended. It had merely adapted, sinking underground where I couldn't easily detect it. My immediate reaction was to wipe my entire phone, a factory reset that left me without contacts or personal data, all to ensure that whatever vile presence lingered in the code would be expunged. And for a brief time, I felt victorious, confident I had cut out the last malignant root before it could sprout again. But technology has a way of haunting us when we least expect it, and I soon discovered that the problem extended beyond my device. Whenever I used my laptop or tablet after midnight, I would catch glimpses of that same swirling text in corners of the screen, ephemeral messages that disappeared the moment I tried to scrutinize them. Even my friends started to notice odd behaviors whenever they texted me past midnight, strange symbols attached to messages, garbled responses that I never typed. And once, a friend swore they received an audio message from my number featuring a distorted version of my own voice chanting indecipherable phrases. Fear and frustration escalated with each bizarre incident, and I reached a point where I had to confront the possibility that the midnight text chain was not merely an electronic glitch or a nightmare's residue, but something far older and darker, a malignant presence feeding on my connection to the digital realm and exploiting my vulnerabilities through lines of code. It was then that I recalled my grandmother's old stories about correspondences between worlds, warnings she passed down in hushed tones about spirits that could hijack any medium if given a foothold in a person's psychic wounds, and I began to suspect that the midnight text chain was but a modern manifestation of that ancient phenomenon, adapted to haunt me through the technology one relied on. Struggling with sleep deprivation and mounting paranoia, I sought guidance from an old friend who dabbled in folklore, confessing my situation as best I could without sounding entirely unhinged. And to my surprise, she admitted to having researched obscure accounts of spectral communications through telegraphs, radios, and even emails in more recent decades, each story bearing chilling similarities to my own plight. We pored over digital archives and scanned ancient texts about banishing spirits from technological conduits, searching for a remedy that wouldn't involve me isolating myself completely from modern life, and we eventually stumbled upon a fragment of an old superstition that might hold the key. A thorough, ritualistic severing of the chain at the precise hour it manifests, with an act of unwavering resolve akin to shutting a heavy door on a persistent intruder. While the specifics were vague, the gist was clear. If I faced the midnight text chain directly at the moment it appeared, refusing to engage in its manipulative illusions while channeling absolute conviction that it had no further hold on me, I might sever the last threads tethering it to my digital presence, effectively ending its ability to slip unseen into my life. That night, I sat in my living room with all my devices laid out on the table, their screens powered on, and as the clock neared midnight, I felt an overwhelming tension building, a tingling in my fingertips as if the air crackled with static. Yet I steadied myself and prepared to face whatever came through those flickering screens. At the stroke of midnight, every device vibrated, beeped, or lit up simultaneously, displaying a swirling kaleidoscope of text that threatened to hypnotize me with its neon patterns. And I nearly lost my nerve when I saw my own reflection caught in those swirling lines, the terror in my eyes magnified by the luminous shapes dancing across the glass. Summoning every shred of courage, I spoke aloud, a declaration that I refused to accept these messages, that I would not feed this chain with my fear, that it had taken enough from me already. And as I spoke, I began to unplug each device one by one, carefully and methodically severing them from power, ignoring the frantic blinking and buzzing as the text tried to reassert itself. When the last device went dark, a hush fell over the room so profound I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a moment frozen in time where I felt the presence of something monstrous rearing back in disbelief that I had simply denied it any further entry, and for one tense heartbeat, I expected a final surge of aggression, a desperate attempt to cling to my reality. But the moment passed, and the darkness held only my own ragged breathing, a potent silence that nearly brought tears to my eyes as relief washed through me in dizzying waves, carrying the promise that I had at last found the closure I'd been seeking. Collapsing onto the couch, I let out a trembling exhale, uncertain if the threat was truly gone, but feeling an unmistakable lightness in my chest, a sense that the midnight text chain had been cut off at the source, left to wander aimlessly in the void it spawned from without my mind or devices as its anchor. In the weeks that followed, my screens remained blessedly free of cryptic messages and swirling text. My nightmares no longer featured locked doors or mirrored figures, and my daily existence returned to a semblance of normalcy that felt sweeter than I ever remembered. Still, I remained vigilant, determined not to let my guard down completely, because the most haunting truth I discovered in this entire ordeal was that any advanced technology or channel of communication, left unprotected, could be subverted by forces we barely understand, hungry for the secrets we keep and the fears we harbor. And though I found peace, I know that the midnight text chain, or something like it, might manifest again in another place, targeting another unsuspecting soul who dares to let their curiosity override their caution, reminding me that the boundary between reality and nightmare is never as solid as we want to believe. Yet for now, I sleep soundly, phone tucked away before midnight, the clock's silent ticking a comfort rather than a countdown, and each morning I wake to a new day unburdened by cryptic messages or the dread of discovering another piece of my psyche trapped in digital limbo, a victory I treasure even if the price was nearly my sanity. I was certain that dismantling the text chain by powering down my devices at the precise stroke of midnight had granted me a true and final reprieve. Yet in the weeks following my so-called victory over the haunting messages that wormed their way into my dreams, I began to sense subtle cracks forming in the facade of normalcy that I had painstakingly reconstructed. as though the entity or force behind those disturbing midnight texts had only retreated temporarily, lingering just out of reach, and biding its time until I let my guard down enough for it to slip back into my life in some new and terrible form. My first real inkling that the chain was not entirely severed arrived on a quiet Sunday evening, one of those nights where I felt content and almost peaceful, having spent the day cleaning my apartment, reading a thriller novel that now felt strangely tame compared to my own experiences, and making an earnest effort to treat myself to a semblance of normalcy. But as I prepared to crawl into bed, my phone, still meticulously scrubbed clean of questionable apps and set to silent mode after midnight, vibrated on the nightstand with a gentle hum that made my heart drop into my stomach. I glanced at the clock and saw it was precisely 11:59 p.m., not quite the bewitching hour, but close enough to reignite the flickers of dread that I had tried so diligently to smother. So I braced myself and picked up the phone, half expecting to see an unknown number or a ghostly string of symbols, only to be confronted with a mundane message from a coworker innocently asking if I could cover an early shift, which momentarily eased my tension and allowed me to exhale a wavering sigh of relief. Feeling slightly foolish for letting my anxieties get the better of me, I typed a quick response confirming I could help out in the morning, and then set the phone back down, telling myself that if I allowed every late-night text to send me spiraling back into paranoia, I would never function properly again. Yet in that sliver of relief, the clock silently shifted to midnight and my phone, having gone blissfully quiet for a few seconds, began buzzing once more as though possessed by a frantic energy it had withheld until that very moment. I remember wishing desperately that it would be nothing more than a glitch or a spam alert, but as my shaking fingertips lifted the phone to my face, the screen displayed not a phone number this time, but a contact name I recognized all too well. My own name, spelled out in the exact stylized fashion that made me think of those mysterious texts from before. And that single detail was enough to send my heart pounding, because I'd never saved my own name as a contact in my phone, nor did I have any reason to text myself. Before I could even comprehend the ramifications of seeing my own name on the incoming message, the text box popped up with a single sentence reading, "You unplugged me, but I found another socket," which made my breath falter because it sounded so blatantly like a taunt, a direct reference to how I had severed the chain by unplugging my devices at midnight weeks prior, and the knowledge that it had apparently moved on to some new method of contact or some new corner of my digital existence stirred a nauseating fear deep in my gut. In the hush of my bedroom, the only light came from the phone's screen, painting the walls in flickering patterns that seemed to distort as I watched, almost as though the luminous glow itself was alive and shifting, and I could not resist the compulsion to reply, this time with anger rather than fear, demanding that it leave me alone, that I had already broken the chain, and that I refused to become entangled in its horrors again. The response came instantly, as though the entity or spirit had anticipated my outrage, reading, "The chain was never broken, only displaced," which told me all I needed to know about the illusions of safety I had cloaked myself in for the past few weeks, illusions that were now unraveling in real time with each new message, each beep and hum that shattered the fragile quiet of my bedroom. My mind raced through all possible explanations. Perhaps I had inadvertently reinstalled a corrupted backup when I replaced my phone data, or maybe I had clicked on a suspicious email link at some point, letting the malignant presence reinfect my device. But deep down, I sensed that the origin of these texts transcended mere software vulnerabilities, existing in that nebulous realm where nightmares, technology, and the raw edges of reality intertwined. Clutching my phone with clammy hands, I typed, "What do you want from me?" And for a moment, I thought the screen froze because no immediate response appeared, but then an image flashed onto the display, a grainy, pixelated scene that took several seconds for my eyes to decipher. It showed a half-lit room I did not recognize, someplace with peeling wallpaper and an ancient lamp casting a dim, sickly yellow glow. And there was a door in the background, partially ajar, beyond which lay impenetrable darkness. The second image followed, depicting that same door fully open now, and though the darkness beyond it seemed to press forward, I could just make out the silhouette of a figure standing in the threshold, head bowed, arms slack, like a marionette awaiting its puppeteer, a presence so eerie that I had to tear my gaze from the screen just to catch my breath. Finally, a caption appeared in plain text at the bottom of the photo, reading, "You saw me here before," which triggered a sudden rush of recollection, dredging up memories of a fleeting dream or vision I had experienced during my original battles with a midnight text chain, in which I glimpsed a decrepit house reminiscent of the corridor from my earlier nightmares, and a door that led nowhere I wanted to go. A chill swept over me as I realized that, in one of those dreamlike experiences, I had indeed seen a figure lurking near a door in a room with that same wallpaper. an image that had blurred in my memory due to the trauma and confusion of facing the chain for the first time, but now it returned, crisp and horrible, tying threads of the past to the present in a way that felt almost inevitable. Gritting my teeth, I decided I would not let fear paralyze me, so I typed back a single question: how do I stop this for good? Yet the phone gave no new text in return, only another image that replaced the figure with a swirling mass of static, as if the silhouette had dissolved into radio interference, accompanied by a faint beep from the device that reminded me of the old dial-up internet tone, or the static hiss of a detuned radio station, a noise so archaic it felt like a relic from decades past. I realized that the chain was evolving once again, slipping through conventional communication methods and manifesting in any form it pleased: a phone call, a text, an image, or even a corridor in my dreams, shape-shifting to ensure it always remained just beyond my capacity to fully shut it out, and that realization nearly shattered my last vestiges of composure. Deciding that flight was not an option, I resolved to investigate, to figure out exactly where that peeling wallpaper room was located, or at least whether it represented a physical place I could find, because if it did, then maybe confronting it in reality could yield a more permanent resolution than I achieved by simply yanking power cords from my devices. Driven by the faint glimmer of hope that unraveling the chain's origin might weaken its hold, I spent the next day poring over every local real estate listing, historical society reference, and property record I could find, searching for an old house with that distinctive wallpaper pattern or some mention of a door rumored to lead to inexplicable phenomena. My frustration grew as I scrolled through listing after listing, rummaging through old newspaper archives for stories of haunted locations or bizarre sightings that matched the images on my phone, only to come up empty, until I stumbled upon a decades-old article detailing the demolition of a rural property that had once been deemed cursed after a series of unexplained disappearances. Its photos black and white, but still capturing a faint glimpse of a floral wallpaper, with the same repeating motif as the images I'd received. According to the article, that house had been torn down nearly 40 years ago, leaving nothing but a barren lot, which left me with more questions than answers. If the place in the photo didn't physically exist anymore, was the chain showing me a realm outside normal time and space, or perhaps drawing on the residual energy of a place that had left a psychic imprint so strong it lingered even after the walls were gone? As I wrestled with these questions, the text continued each night at midnight, always brief but increasingly foreboding, referencing a lost foundation and rooms that exist only in memory, urging me to seek out something called the Blueprint of Fear, a phrase that made my stomach clench with premonitory dread, as though the chain wanted me to reconstruct that demolished house in some metaphorical sense. Determined not to let it manipulate me blindly, I tried ignoring the messages, letting my phone buzz and beep without reading them. Yet that only led to a new tactic. The chain began infiltrating my email, my social media, even the digital clock on my microwave, each screen flickering with half-second glimpses of the same swirling static, the same cryptic words that I refused to read on my phone, until it felt as if every electronic device in my home was conspiring against me. In those moments, it became brutally clear that the chain was far more pervasive than before, no longer satisfied with simple text messages or calls, seeping into every corner of the technological ecosystem that surrounded me, stretching its tendrils into my routine to ensure I could not escape its presence by turning off a single device, and at times, I considered abandoning my apartment altogether, fleeing to some cabin in the woods with no electricity, no screens, no connection to the digital world. Yet deep down, I knew running would only delay the inevitable, for even if I hid in the wilderness, the chain seemed capable of bridging the gap between dreams and reality, turning the intangible architecture of nightmares into an inescapable labyrinth that would follow me anywhere, which left me with a single viable option: find a way to confront the chain on its own terms, systematically dismantling the illusions it used to trap me, just as I once tried to unplug my devices, but with a more final outcome this time. I began by re-examining the cryptic references from the text: the Blueprint of Fear, Lost Foundation, rooms that exist only in memory, all of which seemed to hint at the idea of constructing or reconstructing the demolished house in some symbolic manner, as though the chain wanted me to piece together the fragments of a puzzle that spanned from my technology to the spectral echoes of a place that no longer physically existed. Remembering how my grandmother had once helped me defeat the chain by providing that symbolic key in my dream, I dug through her old notebooks and diaries, searching for any mention of blueprints or houses that stood at the crossroads of nightmare and reality, and eventually, in a tattered journal hidden at the bottom of a dusty trunk, I found a passage describing how certain locations with traumatic histories can leave behind psychic blueprint, a sort of energetic residue that can be tapped into by malevolent forces seeking an anchor in our world. The journal warned that if one is drawn into that blueprint, Whether through dreams, illusions, or digital transmissions, it could act like a vortex, pulling the unwitting victim deeper into the emotional echoes of past tragedies until they become lost in a labyrinth of residual sorrow and terror, effectively becoming part of the house's memory and fueling the cycle for future victims. That grim revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. The chain wasn't just a random haunting. It was using the blueprint of a demolished house steeped in tragic energy as a template to ensnare me, exploiting every screen in my life to replicate the twisted corridors of that cursed location and lure me deeper into its domain, so that each time I engaged with the chain, I risked giving it more power to shape my reality. Understanding the mechanism gave me a thread of hope. If the blueprint depended on my interaction, my fear, my curiosity, my emotional investment, then perhaps I could starve it by refusing to partake in its illusions, systematically cutting off every channel of communication until it had no anchor left. Yet that meant going beyond merely unplugging devices or ignoring messages. I devised a plan. I would methodically rid my apartment of all screens and internet connections for at least a week, a radical digital detox that involved storing my TV, laptop, phone, and even my car's in-dash display at a secure off-site facility, ensuring they were all turned off and inaccessible, leaving me with only basic amenities: a landline phone without caller ID or text functionality, an analog radio, physical books, and my own wits to keep me company. It took an entire day of hauling electronics and cables to a rented storage locker, explaining to perplexed friends that I needed a break from technology due to stress, though I omitted the supernatural horror details. And by the time I returned to my bare-bones apartment, I felt naked and vulnerable, yet oddly liberated by the absence of glowing screens that could serve as portals for the chain. That night, I lit candles instead of relying on electric lights, sipped tea, and tried to calm my restless mind, reminding myself that without the digital conduits, the chain would have a much harder time manifesting in my environment. And though I still feared it could assault me in my dreams, I felt a kind of cautious optimism that I was taking meaningful steps towards severing its hold. At around midnight, I heard the distant sound of static, faint but unmistakable, drifting from the ancient radio I kept on my kitchen counter as a purely decorative item, a relic from my grandmother's estate that I hadn't used in years, and my chest tightened in anxiety, realizing I had overlooked the possibility that the chain might exploit analog signals the same way it did digital ones. My hand shook as I approached the radio, the dials glowing with a soft, ghostly light, and the static grew louder, forming an almost rhythmic pattern that reminded me of breathing, or maybe the pulsing of some hidden heartbeat, and then I heard my name crackle through the speaker, warped and fragmented. I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to respond or tamper with the radio, knowing that acknowledging it could be akin to opening a door. So I tried to hold my ground, telling myself I had come too far to let this single oversight destroy my entire plan, but the voice in the static persisted, intensifying until I could hardly think. Eventually, I steeled my resolve, picked up the radio, and carried it onto my balcony, where I unceremoniously dropped it into the dumpster below. The crash echoing through the alley, followed by the blessed silence of severed transmission, and though I felt a pang of guilt for disposing of a sentimental heirloom, I reminded myself that it was better to let an object go than to let a malignant force manipulate it and drag me back into the labyrinth. For the rest of that week, I slept uneasily, plagued by intermittent nightmares that hinted at the chain's presence hovering just beyond my awareness. But without screens or radios to lure me, it seemed unable to fully break through into my waking life, leaving me hopeful that my drastic measures were working, and by the seventh day, I woke to a morning that felt inexplicably fresh and free, as though a stifling weight had been lifted from my apartment. Bolstered by this sense of victory, I carefully retrieved my electronics from storage, reasoning that it was time to see if the chain had truly been banished, or if it had simply lain dormant during my self-imposed blackout, and my heart pounded as I plugged in my laptop and phone, bracing for an onslaught of messages or flickering images the moment they powered up. To my relief, hours passed without incident. No cryptic texts, no haunting calls, no swirl of static infecting my screen, and although I felt cautious, I also dared to believe that I had succeeded in starving the chain, forcing it to detach from me entirely since it could no longer feed on my engagement or anchor itself through my devices. I updated my friends about my digital detox, promising that I was in a better headspace now. And indeed, I felt calmer, freer from the oppressive dread that had clouded my thoughts for so long. Yet a small corner of my mind refused to let me relax completely, a voice whispering that the chain could still lurk somewhere, waiting for me to become complacent. True to that fear, a few nights after reconnecting my devices, I woke in the early hours of the morning to see my phone screen lit up across the room, not ringing or buzzing, simply illuminated as if it had been turned on manually, and with my pulse hammering in my ears, I staggered over to check the display, half expecting to see my own name listed as the sender of a new message. Instead, I found my phone's camera app open, capturing a murky video feed of my bedroom, as though it had been triggered by some external command, and the faint greenish tint of the screen made every shadow in the room look impossibly tall, looming over my bed in twisted shapes that flickered as I moved. My breath caught in my chest when I realized the camera was focused on a corner of the room where I kept a bookshelf, and behind that shelf was a wall vent that I barely paid attention to. Yet the camera was zoomed in on that vent as if something behind it was generating electromagnetic interference or drawing the device's attention in a way that made no logical sense. Summoning my courage, I tapped the phone's screen to exit the camera, and for a fleeting moment, a text prompt popped up, "Signal found," followed by a spattering of indecipherable characters. Then the phone abruptly powered off, leaving me in total darkness and forcing me to confront the possibility that the chain was not banished but rather forced into a subtler method of infiltration, burrowing into my environment at an even more fundamental level. The next day, I inspected that wall vent, half expecting to find some hidden device or old piece of wiring that could explain the phone's odd behavior, but all I found was a dusty conduit that snaked through the walls, presumably connecting to the building's outdated HVAC system, which made me wonder if the chain had begun manifesting as a literal signal traveling through the physical structure of my home. This horrifying notion led me to recall the old legends of haunted houses that seemed to breathe and pulsate with unnatural energies, as if the walls themselves acted like a living organism. It dawned on me that perhaps the chain was not restricted to screens and radios at all. It could have advanced to using the very architecture around me, resonating through wires, vents, and metallic structures, commandeering any conduit available in its relentless pursuit of a stable anchor in my world. Driven by a new wave of desperation, I sought out an expert in paranormal architecture, a reclusive scholar I tracked down through obscure message boards, who claimed to have studied places rumored to trap restless spirits or malevolent energies in their walls. And although I approached them with skepticism, I was running out of rational options, especially since my prior attempts at severing the chain's digital connections were only partially successful. The scholar, a soft-spoken yet intensely focused individual, listened patiently as I recounted the entire saga, from the initial midnight text to the unplugging ritual and subsequent re-infiltration of my phone, and after a long silence, they informed me of an arcane practice they called structural exorcism, a rare rite that involved tracing protective symbols along the hidden lines of a building's infrastructure. Vents, pipes, wiring conduits, foundation blocks, in order to disrupt any flow of negative energy that might use the structure as a vessel. They warned me that such a rite was not guaranteed to succeed, especially if the malevolent force was powerful or adaptable, but if it was truly using the building as a resonant chamber, sealing off those pathways with a carefully orchestrated symbolic barrier might at least drive it out or weaken it enough for me to banish it once and for all. So I decided it was worth the risk, no matter how bizarre it sounded. Over the next few days, I meticulously charted the blueprint of my apartment, marking every vent, pipe, electrical conduit, and beam, each line of the map overlapping in a complicated web, and though it seemed like an impossible task, I had to remind myself that the chain's infiltration could be equally complex, weaving itself through every accessible channel in a labyrinthine pattern that mirrored the blueprint of that demolished house from decades ago. Following the scholar's instructions, I mixed a special chalk with salt, crushed lavender, and a few drops of consecrated oil, forming a paste that I could apply to hidden parts of the apartment, from the interior of vents to the corners of crawl spaces, effectively drawing a protective boundary across every structural line the chain might exploit. Each night, I worked by flashlight, crawling under sinks, opening ceiling panels, braving the claustrophobic space behind the walls, scrawling intricate runes that I barely understood but trusted to function as wards against intrusion, all while listening for the slightest hint of static or that dreaded beat that often preceded the chain's manifestations. And although the process was exhausting, it felt empowering to take such a physical stance against the intangible force that had terrorized me for so long. When the last rune was drawn and every vent and conduit marked with a chalky paste, I collapsed on my living room floor, sweaty, bruised, and covered in grime from the crawl spaces, but a simmering hope glowed in my chest, a conviction that maybe, just maybe, I had closed off the final avenues by which the chain could anchor itself. As I lay there, my eyes caught the blinking light of my phone on the coffee table, a silent notification reminding me that midnight was near, and I realized I faced a final test. If the chain still existed in my space, it would attempt one more push to breach the protective wards, and if it failed, I might finally be free. With that thought in mind, I forced myself to my feet, grabbed the phone, and watched the digital clock tick over to 12 o'clock, mentally steeling myself for that inevitable buzz or flicker, but nothing happened. No call, no text, no swirling lines of code, and after a tense few minutes, the phone screen remained dark and inert, as though it were just an ordinary device. Relief flooded my entire being, and I found myself laughing hysterically tears running down my face as a huge weight lifted from my psyche, and although exhaustion overwhelmed me, I felt a certainty that I had beaten the chain at its own game, sealing off the building's architectural blueprint against the malignant energies that tried to replicate the old house's cursed foundation. In the days that followed, I waited for any sign of re-emergence. Flickers on my laptop screen, mysterious symbols in my texts, static over the radio, or nightmares dragging me back to those rotting corridors. But all remained calm, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I experienced genuine peace, even going so far as to sleep with my phone on my bedside table without fear. Though I suspected the chain might still exist in some abstract dimension, waiting for an unwary host to open the gateway again, I clung to the knowledge that I had warded my home against it, forging a personal fortress of chalk, runes, and unwavering resolve, and in doing so, I had reclaimed my life from the clutches of a phenomenon that once seemed unstoppable. Freed from the crippling dread that had governed my every move, I rejoined the world of technology with renewed caution, acknowledging that each screen could still harbor ghosts if left unprotected, but trusting that I understood enough now to spot the early signs of infiltration and shut them down before they multiplied into a chain reaction of midnight horrors. In time, I resumed my normal routines, forging new hobbies and friendships, opening myself to the digital realm's wonders without letting it define me, all the while carrying the memory of my own resilience as a shield against whatever nightmares might lurk at the crossroads of technology and the unknown, ready to pounce on those who venture too far without vigilance. And though I never forgot the terror of the midnight text chain, I found the strength to transform that memory into a cautionary tale rather than an open wound, a private reminder that the house of my soul, just like my physical apartment, could be fortified against intruders, no matter how cunning or persistent they might be, so long as I refused to let my fear be the key that opened every door. I admit I felt triumphant after the structural exorcism, convinced my painstaking ritual of chalk and runes had effectively sealed the malignant presence out of my apartment. Yet over the following weeks, a quiet restlessness settled over me, as if the chain, even in defeat, had left behind lingering traces of unease I couldn't quite purge from my psyche, prompting me to question whether my hard-won peace was genuine or merely a calm before the final storm I feared might still loom ahead, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Despite going about my normal routines, returning to my work projects, reconnecting with friends through cautious texts and carefully monitored video calls, and indulging in small pleasures like watching a movie or cooking a complex meal, I found myself on constant alert, compelled to glance at every reflective surface in my apartment for subtle anomalies, or to listen for faint static sounds that might signal the chain clawing its way back in. In the earliest days of this new era, I forced myself to remain relaxed and to trust my wards, reminding myself that I had survived the chain's most vicious intrusions and that any flicker of leftover dread might merely be an echo of the trauma I'd endured. But each time I passed the chalk-lined vents and carefully etched symbols under the sinks, I felt a tiny jolt, recalling how those unassuming lines and sigils had been my final bulwark against a force that defied reason. My nights were thankfully uneventful, my sleep deeper than it had been in months, which lent credibility to the idea that the chain's hold had indeed been broken. Yet it also made the re-emergence of nightmares all the more jarring, because on the rare occasions I did dream, I found myself revisiting the spectral corridors of that vanished house, now dim and empty, as though all its malevolent energy had finally fled, leaving behind a hollow shell. In these dreams, I often wandered from room to room, expecting to see the ominous door that had so terrified me in the early stages of my ordeal, only to find it missing or standing ajar with nothing but vacant darkness beyond, a stark contrast to the swirling horrors that used to wait behind it. Though my mind couldn't decide whether that emptiness was comforting or foreboding, as if something might one day fill that void again. During my morning coffee, I would reflect on these muted nightmares and breathe a cautious sigh of relief, interpreting them as a sign that whatever entity once dwelled in that place no longer had the power to manifest actively in my subconscious. But I remained guarded, knowing that malevolent forces often lurk in the periphery, patient and cunning. When a friend invited me on a weekend retreat to a lakeside cabin that offered minimal cell reception and no Wi-Fi, I hesitated only briefly, recalling how isolation could sometimes feed illusions or paranoia, but ultimately decided it might do me good to spend a few days away from the chalk-riddled apartment, testing whether I truly felt safer because the chain was gone, or because I'd barricaded myself in protective wards like a fortress under siege. The drive to the cabin felt almost surreal, as though I were crossing a threshold between the life I'd known, mired in the tension of ghostly messages and digital infiltration, and a tentative step into a simpler reality free of those supernatural entanglements. And as the pines whipped by my windows, I felt my shoulders unclench in gradual increments, the fresh air promising a respite I craved more deeply than I realized. Upon arrival, I discovered a quaint wooden structure perched by the lake's edge, its reflection dancing on the ripples of the water, a tranquil image that should have comforted me immensely. Yet as soon as I cut the engine and stepped onto the gravel driveway, I sensed a faint static in the air, akin to the charge before a lightning storm, and I caught myself glancing at my phone even though I expected no signal. A deeply ingrained habit from my time under the chain's sinister influence. My friend greeted me warmly, sharing jokes and helpful instructions on how to operate the old-fashioned wood stove inside the cabin. And for time we joked about roughing it without our usual digital attachments, cooking dinner over the stove while we chatted by lamplight, the flickering flames casting comforting shadows across the rustic furniture, providing a sense of homespun ease I'd almost forgotten existed in a world dominated by screens. When dusk settled, we decided to head outside for a short walk around the lake, carrying lanterns to guide our path under the towering pines, though a subtle tension gnawed at my stomach. Recalling how nighttime had always been the chain's favored window of attack, its midnight texts insinuating themselves into my life when the veil between day and dream felt thinnest. As we circled back to the cabin, an odd hush fell over the landscape, and although the evening's chorus of crickets and distant animal calls continued as expected, it felt muted somehow, as though a translucent barrier separated us from the world's natural rhythms, and I stared at the lake's surface under the moonlight, detecting faint ripples that suggested movement beneath, yet I couldn't see what caused them. The moment I stepped into the cabin, my phone lit up in my pocket, a small miracle given the lack of reception, and my heart plunged as I carefully fished it out, half expecting to see that dreaded unknown number, or worse yet, my own name listed as the sender. But no notification appeared on the lock screen, just a bright glow that vanished as quickly as it came, prompting me to double-check the phone's offline status. I discovered that my phone had somehow connected to a weak signal, enough to attempt retrieving data but not enough to load anything coherent, and though my friend shrugged it off as a quirk of being near the water, I couldn't shake the sense that some presence was once again reaching across distances to breach my carefully guarded reality, stirring the waters of my fear. Determined not to panic, I set my phone to airplane mode and stuffed it into my duffel bag, refusing to let my imagination run wild over a minor technical glitch, and we spent the remainder of the evening chatting about mundane topics, sipping warm drinks by the fireplace, and playing a battered old board game we found in a closet. But underneath my forced laughter and smiles lay a knot of apprehension that refused to untangle. Sleep came fitfully, aided by the lullaby of gentle waves lapping at the shore, yet my dreams carried me back to that dematerialized house, its hallways oddly reasserting themselves with sharper clarity, the wallpaper's faded floral pattern re-emerging from the gloom, and though I told myself to keep calm, I felt a presence in the hallway with me, something small and curious, not overtly hostile but undeniably there, shuffling just beyond the flickering lamp's glow. In the dream, I saw a silhouette that reminded me of a child, stooped with arms at its sides, peering at me from behind a corner, its eyes wide and reflective as if it had never seen another person in that place, and part of me wanted to call out, to ask who it was or why it lingered in these decaying corridors. But fear gagged the words in my throat until I jerked awake, heart racing, in the cabin's chilly bedroom. I found my friend still asleep, curled in a sleeping bag on the floor nearby, the lantern extinguished and the moonlight casting silver beams across the wooden floor. But as I adjusted my eyes to the darkness, I glimpsed my phone's screen lit up in the duffel bag across the room, though it was set to airplane mode, an impossibility that nonetheless sent adrenaline surging through my veins. Slipping out of bed, I approached the bag in slow, measured steps, each plank on the cabin floor creaking in protest, half expecting to see a message from the chain beckoning me to open the device. Yet when I finally unzipped the bag, I found only the phone's lock screen active, displaying no notifications and no missed calls, shining that cold glow into the gloom as if laughing at my attempts to remain unplugged. Weary of repeating old mistakes, I resisted the urge to interact with it, instead shutting the phone off completely and removing the battery for good measure, telling myself that any further activity on a powerless phone would confirm, beyond doubt, that the chain had transcended conventional technology once again, though the thought alone was unsettling enough to disrupt my sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, my friend questioned why I looked so ragged, and though I tried to explain that I had nightmares, I refrained from mentioning the phone lighting up, worried I might ruin our getaway by diving into the details of my ongoing battle with a seemingly inexhaustible supernatural force, but the heaviness in my chest was apparent enough that he offered to drive us out for a relaxing day in a nearby town. We spent the afternoon browsing quaint shops, savoring lunch at a local diner, and chatting about innocuous topics unrelated to curses or haunted devices, which brought a welcome distraction from my restless thoughts. Yet every so often, I found my eyes wandering to reflections in storefront windows, half expecting to see that same childlike silhouette hovering behind me, an echo from my dream stepping into the waking world. Returning to the cabin at twilight, we found the door slightly ajar, though my friend swore he had locked it before we left, and a chill ran through me, imagining that perhaps some unlucky wildlife had nosed its way inside while we were gone, or worse yet, the chain had manifested in some physical intrusion, using the structure as a conduit for infiltration despite my protective wards back home. Our search through the cabin revealed no obvious signs of a break-in, aside from a puddle of water near the threshold, small enough to dismiss as a leak or a clumsy step from someone's wet shoes, but it left a strange brackish odor that neither of us could quite identify, reminding me vaguely of stagnant water or something dredged up from a lake bed. That night, I insisted we secure the cabin more thoroughly, wedging a chair under the doorknob and blocking the windows with improvised barriers, while my friend teased me for being paranoid, yet humored me all the same, apparently deciding it was better to indulge my anxious requests than to risk another sleepless night. As we settled in by lantern light, the air felt charged, the cabin's old walls groaning faintly, and my friend tried to distract me with jokes and card games, but I found my attention riveted to the faint patter of water dripping somewhere, a consistent rhythm that suggested a persistent leak, or perhaps something far stranger. Eventually, we followed the sound to a tiny crawl space beneath the kitchen counter, discovering that a pipe had indeed sprung a slow leak, which accounted for the watery puddle near the door. Yet the water itself had a peculiar slimy texture, and the smell pricked at my senses, evoking memories of nightmares in which I'd glimpsed black water dripping from walls in that ghostly corridor. An unsettling parallel I prayed was purely coincidental. After shutting off the cabin's main water valve, we decided to keep an eye on it overnight, resigning ourselves to the inconvenience of no running water, and as I hunkered down in my bedroll, the sense that some intangible presence was swirling around the perimeter of the cabin, testing the barriers we'd set, drove away any vestige of sleep, forcing me to lie awake, listening to the hush of forest wind and my friend's slow breathing. At some point, I must have drifted off because I found myself back in the corridor, trudging toward the same door, the flickering lamplight revealing new blotches of black water seeping through the wallpaper, forming a murky pool at the baseboards, and my stomach lurched with the realization that the childlike silhouette was no longer timidly peeking around corners. It now stood in the open, arms outstretched, beckoning me forward with an eerie determination that hinted at desperation or longing. A wave of sympathy mingled with fear, for I sensed that this figure was not exactly the malevolent chain itself, but rather a remnant of something or someone else trapped by the chain's relentless cycles, a casualty of the psychic blueprint that refused to let any soul rest. And as I inched closer, I saw faint details, an old-fashioned outfit soaked in black water, droplets running down a pale face whose eyes shimmered with a hint of recognition, as though it knew me somehow. I whispered that I meant no harm, that I only wanted to be free of this cursed limbo, but the figure twitched, its head snapping up to reveal a mouth that seemed sewn shut by thin, glistening threads of black weed or algae, preventing it from speaking, and my heart ached at the sight, reminding me of the monstrous illusions the chain once conjured in my own home. Summoning nerve I did not truly possess, I reached out with trembling fingers, intending to tear away those threads so the childlike entity could speak, but as soon as I touched them, a surge of putrid water erupted from the floorboards, knocking me onto my back in a surge of freezing liquid that tasted of mud and decay, and my last glimpse before choking awake was of the entity struggling to mouth a single word, help. The room in the cabin was pitch dark when I bolted upright, water trickling off my forehead. But no, it was just sweat, and my friend stirred from his sleeping bag, alarmed by my sudden movement. Yet I could barely speak, my throat raw from the phantom sensation of drowning, my mind swirling with guilt and confusion over the dream's imagery. Morning came with heavy clouds and a steady drizzle, confining us to the cabin for much of the day. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the watery presence in my nightmare wanted something from me, something that, if satisfied, might resolve this final vestige of the chain's power, and so I confessed the entirety of my ordeal to my friend, from the earliest midnight text to the structural exorcism and these new watery nightmares, leaving nothing out. Though skeptical, he showed genuine concern for my mental state, suggesting that maybe I needed therapy more than spiritual intervention. But when he saw how unwavering my conviction was that something supernatural still lurked at the edges of my reality, he offered to help in any way he could, even if that meant indulging what he called my ritualistic side. We decided to symbolically rescue the childlike figure from my dream by creating a small effigy using the cabin's materials, a piece of driftwood wrapped in cloth, an arrangement of twigs for arms, a simple face drawn with charcoal, and placing it in the watery crawl space under the kitchen, hoping that performing an act of compassion or release might quell the residual energies feeding my nightmares. As we carefully set the makeshift effigy in the puddle of leaked water, I closed my eyes and imagined the childlike silhouette standing before me, stitches across its mouth, black water swirling around its feet, and I silently vowed to free it from the chain's oppressive cycle, to ensure it would no longer be used as a pawn to terrorize unsuspecting dreamers, no matter how real or imaginary this entity might be. For a moment, I thought I felt a chill breeze pass through the cabin, and my friend must have sensed it too, for he shivered despite the mild weather, remarking that the air seemed oddly heavy, as though we were intruding upon a space that didn't entirely welcome us, but we stayed resolute, hoping this gesture would resonate on some metaphysical level. That night, my dreams took on a stark clarity. Once again, I roamed the corridor, yet now the wallpaper was less tattered, the black water receded, and the childlike figure appeared at the far end, free of the algae-like stitches, a soft light emanating from their chest, revealing a faint, grateful smile directed at me, though a deeper sorrow pooled in their eyes, a wordless admission that not all burdens could be cast aside so easily. I followed them through a door that once led to darkness, finding instead a modest room with minimal furniture and a single window admitting a pale moonlight, and there, on the floor, lay the same effigy we had crafted in the cabin, albeit transfigured into a more lifelike form, its driftwood core replaced by delicate wooden bones, a cloth body replaced by translucent flesh that seemed to shimmer at the edges, as though ready to dissolve at any moment. The childlike presence knelt beside the effigy, murmuring words I couldn't understand, but I sensed they were a prayer of sorts, a final farewell to whatever tethered them to the blueprint of that haunted place, and as I approached, the figure held out a small key, reminiscent of the one I'd used in my earlier battles with the chain, and pressed it gently into my hand with an expression of profound relief. Waking with the dawn, I found my friend dozing by the cold fireplace, our improvised effigy still nestled in the puddle below the sink, now nearly dry as though the leak had stopped overnight, and though we exchanged puzzled looks, it felt right to leave the effigy where it lay, letting the faint residue of our symbolic act stand untouched. Over breakfast, I related the final details of my dream, the child's release, and the key they entrusted to me, and while my friend still struggled to believe all the metaphysical ramifications, he conceded that something in my demeanor had shifted, as if a great weight had lifted from my shoulders, a calm I never displayed before. When we returned to our normal lives at the end of the retreat, I discovered that the anxiety I once felt in the face of technology, the dread of seeing flickering screens or receiving cryptic messages, had greatly diminished, replaced by a quiet confidence that if the chain tried to re-emerge, it would find no purchase in my soul, because the blueprint it used to manipulate me, both within my home and within my dreams, had been rendered inert through compassion rather than confrontation. Oddly, my devices seem to function more smoothly now, as though the malware-like disruptions have been eradicated for good. No more random static bursts or phantom messages, no unexplained camera activations or midnight images, and although I remained cautious, scanning my phone logs each morning, I found nothing out of the ordinary, no sign that my own name was trying to text me again. At night, I still dream of quiet hallways and gentle streams of water flowing through old floorboards, but instead of dread, the dreams bring a sense of cleansing, a release of pent-up sorrow I once thought belonged solely to me, yet now I realize might have been shared across time by every soul that ever brushed against that cursed blueprint of a demolished house. Perhaps the chain still roams the digital highways, searching for new cracks in unsuspecting minds, but I take solace in believing that by forging a bond of empathy with the lost childlike fragment that haunted my nightmares, I disrupted the chain's cycle within my personal reality, ensuring that no matter what tactics it tries next, it cannot use my own fear, grief, or curiosity as a gateway to re-enter my life. In the months that followed, I quietly gathered my experiences into a private journal, documenting each unsettling text, each symbolic dream, each act of protective warding or compassionate ritual, weaving together a record that might one day guide another unfortunate soul who stumbles into the chain's path. A lifeline I would have given anything to possess when I first encountered those cryptic messages at midnight. Sometimes in hushed conversations with my friend, I'll mention how this journey changed me, softening my once absolute skepticism about the unknown and teaching me that when we face phenomena beyond logic, confrontation is not always about severing or destroying, but may instead require us to mend the fractures in our own hearts or the hearts of spirits caught in cyclical despair. My grandmother's old diaries, when I revisit them, seem less like relics of a superstitious past and more like testaments to a lineage of quiet battles waged against intangible horrors, battles fought in the liminal spaces of dreams, diaries, and fleeting phone signals, reminding me that I am not the first, nor will I be the last, to wrestle with the boundary between technology and the spectral echoes of tragedy. Though my grandmother never wrote of a chain exactly like the one I encountered, she alluded to mysterious communications that sometimes manifested in the hush between breaths, the silent intervals of radio static or flickering lamps, and I suspect she would understand my ordeal better than anyone, urging me to embrace the peace I have now and warn others of the shadows that lurk in every glowing screen. At long last, I feel comfortable using my phone at midnight again without fearing that a sinister message will appear, and the nightmares no longer hold sway over my daily life, though I sometimes experience fleeting chills when I glimpse a random unknown number calling or a mild static glitch on my computer screen, forced to remind myself that not every glitch heralds a supernatural threat. If the chain ever tries to return, I know I am stronger, armed not merely with wards and exorcisms, but with the understanding that even the darkest apparitions can be touched by empathy and compassion, turned aside by the resolute refusal to let fear, guilt, or curiosity feed the malevolent cycle they thrive on. The memory of that childlike silhouette, once so pitiful and bound by black watery stitches, standing liberated in my dream's corridor, remains a powerful symbol of the final turning point in my story, proving that beneath every haunting lies a tangled knot of sorrow seeking release, and that sometimes the most potent weapon against the intangible is the simple act of acknowledging another's pain and offering to shoulder it together. Though I hope never to encounter such horrors again, I do not regret the journey that forced me to confront my worst fears, to dig through old diaries, perform outlandish rituals, and ultimately reclaim my sense of agency from an entity that thrived on illusions. Because now I see that I was not merely a victim but a conduit for healing, for myself, for the childlike spirit, and perhaps for future souls who might stumble across these accounts and learn to fend off the midnight text chain. Each day, as the sun rises, I open my windows to let fresh air fill my apartment. No longer haunted by the hush of static or the flicker of cryptic messages, each beam of light reminding me that illusions of darkness melt away under the warmth of understanding and the power of unwavering resolve. I still keep the chalk and the leftover runic paste in a small box under my sink as a token of what I accomplished, a testament to the nights I spent scrawling protective symbols in cramped spaces, convinced it was my last shot at banishing a digital ghost. And though the wards remain faintly visible here and there, I find them comforting rather than alarming. Reminders that I took control of my environment and refused to let terror claim my home. My friend and I occasionally laugh about the trip to the cabin, recalling the leak that seemed to vanish by supernatural means, the wooden effigy, and my fervent belief that we were enacting a real solution to a real problem. But under our laughter lies a mutual respect for the determination that drove us to fight for normalcy against a force we barely comprehended. In quiet moments, when I reflect on the winding path that started with a single unnerving text on a sleepless night, I marvel at how intimately the chain had woven itself into the corners of my life, hijacking each piece of technology one owned and each vulnerable recess of my dreams, until I learned to push back on every front, physical, digital, and psychological, ultimately discovering that sometimes the key to victory lies in bridging the gap between fear and empathy. If I were asked to summarize my story to a stranger, I would say this: the midnight text chain came to me in a moment of grief, found cracks in my psyche, manipulated my nightmares, and infiltrated every device I relied on. It nearly consumed me by turning my own curiosity and longing into weapons, yet through determination, a willingness to learn, and an unexpected act of compassion, I turned the tide, severing its grip on my life for good. Of course, I acknowledge there is always a chance that the chain survives in some obscure digital corridor, a virus-like presence scanning the night airwaves for a new target, a fresh set of fears to exploit, but I trust that those who stumble upon it, though they may endure terror and heartbreak, can also find the means to break free, armed with the knowledge that no force thrives forever once compassion and knowledge have taken root. In the end, I choose to see the chain as a lesson, a reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, can become a conduit for ancient forces if we let it, and that the real measure of our humanity lies in how we respond to the unknown, with terror, or with the courage to peel back the layers of dread and see what yearns for release beneath. And if one night the phone does ring again at midnight, displaying my own name with some cryptic message beckoning me deeper into a labyrinth of illusions, I will not tremble as I once did. Instead, I will recall the weight of the chalk in my hand, the memory of that childlike figure set free, and the unwavering truth that my fear cannot be used against me if I name it, face it, and guide it toward the light. For now, I carry on, living day by day without the stifling cloak of anxiety wrapped around my every thought, content in the knowledge that the midnight text chain has slipped from my sphere of reality, perhaps forever, and though I cannot guarantee it's gone for good in the grander scheme of things, I have found closure in my own domain, forging a lasting peace that resonates through my dreams, my devices, and my soul alike.